If you spent much of the last decade under a rock eating crayons and chasing squirrels and haven't watched any of Game of Thrones, this video contains major spoilers of the ending and plot points of the series, as well as a few shiny lights. Game of Thrones is one of the most watched shows in the history of television. It held a record at its height for the most illegal downloads in 2014. Not sure if that helped them at all. You could argue that it promoted HBO subscriptions, but we won't dwell on that too much, and it definitely wasn't something that I did, wink wink. This epic tale of the great houses of Westeros, the people of Essos, the Summer Isles, faceless men of Bravos, dragons, warlocks, and the ageless magic children of the forest, as well as dire wolves, wargs, or skin changers as they're known in the books, giants, free folk, an existential threat of the White Walkers beyond the wall that captured the world's imagination. How is it then that well over 10 years since it began, and a year-long hiatus when it came to the final episode, the Iron Throne, of the final season, the fans were so disappointed with the ending to this epic saga, they started a petition, Remake Game of Thrones with competent writers, which to this day has received over 3 million signatures. Before focusing on what the creators of Game of Thrones did wrong, we first have to acknowledge what they got right. The casting was excellent. The adaptation from the book series known as The Song of Ice and Fire to the TV show Game of Thrones was, for the first 3 seasons, great. It combined established talents such as Sean Bean, Liam Cunningham, Peter Dinklage, and the magnificent Charles Dance, Ian Glenn, Jason Momoa, with new talent Kit Harington, Richard Madden, Alfie Allen, Maisie Williams, Jack Gleeson, Ewan Rheon, although several central characters were recast after a horrendous first attempt at a pilot episode. Emilia Clarke among the new recruits fresh out of drama school as Daenerys Targaryen. The original pilot was apparently so bad they insisted on major changes, principally Tamsin Merchant, the original Daenerys being let go. HBO squandered over $17 million on just the original pilot alone. The executives Emilia danced for no doubt had their own heads on the chopping block at that point, were more than eager to see the show succeed and to justify the expenditure. Emilia recalled receiving the initial scripts after she took her job on Game of Thrones, making note of the nude scenes and thinking to herself, oh, there's the catch. The fact Emilia didn't know there was nudity required or the extent of it until she was offered the part could be characterized as exploitive. Emilia in later seasons insisted on no nudity clause in her contract because she felt the nude scenes were gratuitous and drew attention away from her acting, reportedly saying, people are more focused on my boobs than on my acting. Bizarrely, Emilia was directed to be less emotive during the shooting of the first season, and that accounts for her sometimes wooden performance. This was a critical change in direction. Emilia is a very expressive and likable person, and this transferred effortlessly to her portrayal as Daenerys and earned her a die-hard following. Whereas if she had stayed with the stoic version of Daenerys, where her values appeared to align with what is decent and fair, but we couldn't get a read on just what she was feeling most of the time, the turn towards the genocidal in the final season wouldn't have been so hard to buy. It wasn't very smart to keep her principal actor in the dark about her character's mentality. Emilia only learned about Daenerys being the final endgame boss when she read the script, and was so shocked and upset by it, she went out and walked for hours to settle herself down. This flies in the face of everything George R. R. Martin believes in. In his view, if all the clues lead to the butler did it, then you can't, as David and Dan suggested, subvert expectations and say, oh, well, the chef did it. Surprise. I remember at the time the episode The Bells aired, there was a lot of discussion online about foreshadowing in the books and in the show that Daenerys could go down that path. Those people were essentially right, but what they weren't registering was the extent to which the show gave us Daenerys' anguish at the suffering of others through Emilia Clarke as an actress, who thought she was playing a good person forced to do ruthless things on occasion, rather than a ruthless person adhering to her moral code, but capable of dishing out cruelty to anyone and everything that stood in her way. Interestingly, Catelyn Stark in the first pilot was originally played by Jennifer L. of the BBC's 1995 adaptation of Pride and Prejudice fame, but due to personal reasons, rumored to have been a pregnancy, relinquished the role to Irish actress Michelle Fairley. Gillian Anderson of X-Files fame allegedly played Cersei Lannister, or at least auditioned for the part, which ultimately ended up with Lena Headey. According to Dave and Dan, the show's creators, the test audience had no clue of the scale of the world and didn't pick up on the incestuous relationship between Jaime and Cersei Lannister, or its ramifications for the rest of Westeros. The major flaw of Game of Thrones may have been its conception. George R. R. Martin might have been overly susceptible to a pitch for a Game of Thrones TV show, with having experienced success himself as a TV writer, first on Twilight Zone and then on Beauty and the Beast, starring Terminator's Linda Hamilton and Hellboy himself, Ron Perlman, as the Beast. George found the constraints put on him by the show's producers extremely frustrating. He had masterfully created a story about a subterranean society with intelligent commentary on greed and hostility of the surface world we inhabit. The producers, however, had their own ideas and wanted the show to be more focused on romance and insisted on the beast mauling bad guys, or as they put it, beasting out on the regular. George hated the many rules of TV show scripts, such as the one that barred characters having similar names. Tyrion, Tywin, Tysha would have caused the TV executives to have an aneurysm. George left the industry determined to create a story as big as his imagination. The story he created was A Song of Ice and Fire, and the first novel of that saga was titled, you guessed it, Game of Thrones. George had created something that flew in the face of by the numbers fancy, all the while glancing over his shoulder, wondering if the TV industry that had bullied him into submission would one day recognize his true talent for world building and crafting realistic and beautifully complex characters. Indeed, it may have been his overly zealous need to be readmitted into the upper echelon of Hollywood establishment that led George to make the mistake of accepting the advances of two novice screenwriters and aspiring showrunners David Benioff and Dan Wise. The world on his dog at this point noted writing on the show drastically deteriorated after he ran out of source material. It could be argued that the writing rock started with Dan and Dave experimenting with changes in season 3. Lady Jane Westling became Lady Talisa Myger of Volantis. Now, the only rational benefit they got from this was the exposition of Talisa telling Robb the story about how she came to understand slavery in her home city was a great injustice. It detracts from Daenerys' storyline, which witnesses the horrors of slavery firsthand. It was more than an unnecessary addition to Robb's story arc. It may seem like a minor change of a minor character that we were never really invested in, but the key detail that Jane Westling is not only not the daughter or granddaughter of his bannerman Walder Frey that he had sworn to marry, she is the daughter of Lord Westerling, a bannerman for House Lannister. It is an enormous betrayal. Can you imagine how the lords following Robb would feel? You were the lord and bannerman of Robb Stark riding off and fighting battles, risking your life and the lives of your sons for months on end. Your king not only doesn't honour your achievements on the battlefield by marrying your daughter, but marries a random daughter of your enemy, that most likely killed some of your kin. In the book, Robb had just learned of Bran and Rickon's alleged deaths at the hands of Theon Greyjoy. He is devastated. Jane Westling comforts him. They have sex, and he feels a duty to marry her to preserve her honour. There's so much nuance to it, and parallels with Ned Stark. Most of the Seven Kingdoms wrongfully thought, including Robb, that Ned had betrayed his marriage vow and fathered Jon Snow with a woman that was not his wife. Was all of that on Robb's mind when he made the decision to marry Jane? He could have been thinking, if the most honourable man he knew took comfort with a woman while fighting at war, he should too. Robb was close to Jon Snow and knew how hard it was for Jon growing up as a bastard. Was the reason he married Jane to spare a possible child of growing up to have the same experience? We will never get to ponder on that one. Because David and Dan decide to have a random love story between Robb and Talisa. Is Una Chaplin delightful as Talisa? Of course, but the character change itself feels unnecessary as well as odd. It feels as though they are hitting you over the head with a clumsy social commentary. Having this outspoken woman who doesn't mind telling a king it's wrong to be fighting wars and having peasants killed for his cause, especially when he doesn't know precisely what he's planning. It felt very trite. It doesn't really feel like it belongs in the show at all. Unfortunately, it comes across as woke. This cut and swap was the first sign in the show that not only were they tone deaf to the intricacies of George's writing, but they weren't very good writers themselves. The next significant cut and swap, season 4, Tyrion is condemned to death, reminiscing about his cousin Orson smashing beetles. We don't know who actually wrote this because David, Dan, and Brian Cogman had a habit of switching writing credits. Probably got wind of the criticism and tried the old bait and switch. This was a particularly dreadful piece of writing. To summarize it, Tyrion recalls his cousin who had suffered brain damage as a result of his wet nurse dropping him on his head, mercilessly killing mounds of beetles, and the kind-hearted young Tyrion obsessively trying to understand why. I suppose just coming to the conclusion people are cruel and vindictive to the little things in life. What it replaced was something crucial and a powerful piece of character progression. Jaime, with his own journey towards becoming the virtuous knight he could have always been without the manipulative Cersei, confesses that Tyrion's first wife, Tysha, wasn't a paid prostitute, but was in fact just a common girl that had fallen in love with him, and that Tywin had made Jaime lie to Tyrion. This is a huge revelation. Jaime was the only Lannister Tyrion had a normal loving relationship with, and he betrayed him. The final ties to the family and duty are viciously cut in that moment. Tyrion warns Jaime that if he sees him again he will kill him. This adds even more weight to the confrontation between Tyrion and Tywin as he sits on the privy. Tyrion demands to know where Tysha went, and all Tywin will say is, "Wherever whores go," which is a line Tyrion mutters to himself throughout the rest of the books. This is what George does. He introduces a world to us with clear boundaries of duty, family and honour, warns us that kinslaying is one of the most heinous acts. To kill your own family is something that will curse a person. But here he gives us the perfect protagonist to a story of how a person could be justified in utterly despising a father they'd spent their whole life trying to earn their respect. Standing there knowing he had his first love, his wife, gang SA just out of pure spite at him being born a dwarf. It's hard to imagine anyone in Tyrion's position not firing the crossbow. Now, I have to give credit where credit is due. Peter Dinklage being cast as Tyrion was a masterstroke, and the decision not to go with the description of Tyrion from the books was a great one. Book Tyrion is almost goblin-like in appearance, has two different coloured eyes and hair that is almost Targaryen in comparison to Lannister fair hair. Now, that could seem inconsequential, but the story had established that hair colour is a key factor in denoting lineage in Westeros. When Joffrey's bastard status is exposed, it has always been hinted at and speculated that Tyrion may have been the bastard son of King Aerys Targaryen, the Mad King, and that is why Tywin hates him so much. Changing the story makes Tywin's rejection of him as his heir even crueler. It would make it purely based on him being a dwarf. Peter Dinklage has recently spoken out against dwarf stereotypes. It is reasonable to speculate that he could have influenced Dave and Dan into altering Tyrion's character, appearance, and story. In the books, when we are first introduced to Tyrion, he performs acrobatic stunts. And after he kills Tywin and flees King's Landing, he travels with the Mummers, a travelling dwarf act, and has a potential love interest in a fellow dwarf named Penny. Are these dwarf story cliches that Peter wanted to avoid? The showrunners decided to give the Tyrion and Shae romance more emphasis. The show at this point had garnered a massive following. They had market researchers scrutinizing over all the demographics trying to work out who was watching and which people weren't watching. It isn't hard to see why they chose to dump this part of the story. A few phenomena were factors here. So they came back with Q ratings telling them which characters were resonating with the audience and how vast swathes of women were supposedly put off by all the female nudity. They also concluded that their new audience had the memory retention of goldfish, so expecting them to recall the story Tyrion told in season 1 was out of the question. Book Shae's feelings for Tyrion were ambiguous. You really couldn't get a tell if she genuinely wanted a future with him, or if it was just his wealth and status she was after. Joe Shae clearly loved Tyrion, so Tysha and Shae overlapped and were overkill for a TV show. So they went with the talented Sybil Kikili's portrayal of the prostitute scorned by her lover, hell-bent on revenge rather than just being a scheming money grabber. That would be at odds with modern intersectional feminist ideology. The writer George R. R. Martin once praised for his ability to write strong, intelligent, compelling female characters. Now found his work being given a rewrite by intersectional feminist producers, writers, fans, and even actresses. What's wrong with a bit of feminism, you say? Sure, it only promotes equality between men and women. Where's the harm in that, right? Not intersectional feminism. They believe the differences between men and women are only a social construct. That women can be just as physically strong as men if only they were raised to believe it, and more crucially, if the patriarchy would just stop oppressing them. It's a misconception that the writing deteriorated when they ran out of source material. They proactively decided to dump a large story arc. The Dornish plot in the books, Prince Oberyn's older brother Doran has a daughter named Arianne Martell, and she is, according to Dornish law, is his heir, and next in line to rule over Dorne, the only kingdom never to be conquered by the Targaryens. Arianne uses her feminine wiles to seduce several knights into kidnapping Myrcella in an attempt to proclaim her queen of the Seven Kingdoms. As by Dornish law, the eldest living child is the rightful heir, regardless of sex. By being the wife of a Prince of Dorne would give control of the Seven Kingdoms to House Martell. The plan ultimately fails, resulting in Myrcella losing an ear. Doran's eldest son, Quentyn Martell, travels in secret to Meereen, attempting to gain Daenerys Targaryen's hand in marriage. The reason for excluding it all, it could be the showrunners and producers thought another storyline with a woman not displaying masculine traits of a man didn't align with their progressive attitudes. They would have objected to Cersei's methods of seductively acquiring power as well if it weren't already established in the show. Quentyn adding to Daenerys' boy troubles was no doubt scoffed at as well. This was the alteration that pushed the show past the books. If they had remained faithful to the source material, they could have easily stretched out an entire season worth of screen time with Dorne and fleshed out storylines like Daenerys developing what appears to be paranoid schizophrenia, so a return to the genocidal mania didn't appear to be so sudden. What did we get instead? A clumsy, rushed, cringe-inducing version of the Sand Snakes, Oberyn Martell's bastard daughters, Ilaria leading some bizarre feminist revolt in the only kingdom that doesn't differentiate between male and female heirs, murdering the Prince of Dorne, the most beloved family in Dorne. Why? Because he wouldn't start a war to avenge a brother that died in a fair fight against Gregor Clegane, a fight he himself chose to participate in? Yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense. The producers deserve a lot of credit for casting Pedro Pascal, who was more than up to the task of playing Oberyn, a character that is beloved by many Song of Ice and Fire fans. He was charismatic and conveyed the emotional gravity of his pursuit for vengeance with ease. I will say the same for the casting of the Sand Snakes as well. However, almost all of the scenes involving Dorne were horrendously bad, from the grass in the desert country to the nothing short of farcical fight sequence involving Jaime and Bronn versus the Sand Snakes in the Water Gardens. The fight sequence is so bad it makes the choreographers for Power Rangers TV show blush. When the Sand Snakes are surrounded by guards, Obara-san proclaims that she is Prince Oberyn's daughter and she fights for Dorne, and asks who amongst them fights for Dorne, meaning she wants them to help her harm a little girl as vengeance. All of this in spite of Oberyn himself assuring Cersei that Dorne does not harm little girls. Prince Doran's guards have a wall hack and suddenly run off to arrest Ilaria San, who is still waiting in a nearby passageway. The explanation for why it looked so cramped and cheesy was down to the limited amount of time available to film on location because it was a real palace in Alcázar Sevilla in Spain. This was a huge failure by the location manager, director, executive producers. There isn't a person with a functioning hippocampus that would watch these scenes and think it matches the standard of the previous seasons. We get a bunch of scenes in Dorne where they give fan service to their Q-score hero Bronn by flashing the most beautiful pair of boobs in Dorne at him. Ilaria Sand poisons Myrcella. The Sand Snakes then teleport from Dorne to King's Landing, where their cousin Prince Justine is on his ship, painting some funeral stones for Myrcella's eyes. They give him a choice of which of them will kill him. Because this is fun, guys. Killing your cousin for no reason. So badass. This is good stuff. And they surround with their weapons, drawn so badass and heroic. What better way to prove women are better and warriors than men, than ganging up on a teenage boy? The courage must have taken for to do that. I'm choking back tears here. Who can forget the inspiring line that could only have been written by a purple-haired 13-year-old misandrist? Ilaria Sand, as she stabs Prince Doran in the chest. Dorne will never again be ruled by weak men. The show veered into proactively pushing intersectional feminist archetypes. Brienne of Tarth beating the Hound was a turn towards ridiculous. George R. R. Martin, through interviews, has given us a scale to which we can measure each fighter in Planetos, the name given to the world in which Westeros resides. He was asked if Gregor Clegane's renowned strength, for instance, was purely based on his enormous size, and he said no. The amount of strength was, in part, supernatural. Sandor isn't Gregor, but he does have some unknown amount of supernatural strength and battle prowess. Brienne of Tarth is a tall woman with competent abilities as a swordswoman. She by no means would have the strength or skill to beat the Hound in a fight. The whole scene was fan service to the Girl Power Brigade. By itself is no big deal. It was a clear sign of the show trying to amp up female aggression and violence on the show, as well as anti-men sentiments. Olenna Tyrell, the Queen of Thorns, being the worst example. Her interaction with Brienne, telling her that she heard Brienne knocked her grandson into the dirt like the silly little boy that he was a huge disservice to the character of Loras Tyrell, whom, of all the Game of Thrones characters, a competent knight deserved being emasculated the least, having broken every gay stereotype. Many of the Ice and Fire books readers admire the reverence given to Loras and Renly's Baratheon's relationship, and the unending grief Loras appeared to suffer after Renly's murder. But nah, the show decided to belittle him and have him flirting with Oberyn and shagging the first guy that looks his way instead. Olenna tells Marjorie to be careful what she says, even in her company, when in the next episode, while out in public, brags about murdering Joffrey and shagging her sister's fiancé. Neither bits of information were essential for Marjorie to know. She even dropped in a great little nugget that marrying Targaryens was all the rage in her youth. Every girl and boy in Westeros since Aegon's conquest wanted to marry a Targaryen. They were the ruling royal family. Turning down a marriage proposal from a Targaryen would be like a lot of winner immediately spending it all on Magic the Gathering cards. It wouldn't be impossible. It would lead everyone related to them saying, ah, shite. But girl power. Brienne's conversation with Cersei, where Cersei seems to intuit Brienne's love for Jaime, was as cheesy as it was pointless, and like something hurriedly written last minute for a soap opera scene like Neighbours or Melrose Place. Arya Stark, where to start? She was a great character in the book, and on screen, a little girl we watched survive the horrors of her father being executed, the rest of her family being murdered. Trained lethal stealth assassin with a list of enemies as long as your arm. That's the problem. Her hero story should begin and end with her list of vengeance. Joffrey, Sir Meryn, Trant, Ilyn Payne, Walder Frey, the Mountain, the Hound, and Cersei are legitimate targets to have context within her story arc. Killing the Night King, a threat she learns about one day and kills the next, is a major anticlimax. Ironically, the actress Maisie Williams, that plays Arya, excitedly after reading the script, went home and told her then boyfriend about Arya killing the Night King, and her boyfriend's response sums it up perfectly. But that should be Jon. He was right. The guy that's entire story arc revolves around encountering the power of the Whites and the White Walkers and the ramifications of their existence for the rest of Westeros from the very beginning. Hey, don't let anyone tell you that I wouldn't watch a show about a 100-pound girl ragdolling a guy twice her size. I was a huge fan of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, so just never at the expense of overwriting someone else's original creative work and vision. Dan Wise is on the record as saying that he let the actors redefine the roles, especially Maisie, and they began writing for the actors. It is like the actors moved into their house and redecorated, he said. He learned about the characters from the actors, asked if he was listening to the feedback from the fans as things went along. Dan Wise responded, "We really did not." Dan Wise didn't see the value of considering other people's reactions. David Benioff acknowledged that he Googled the show and it upset him. Casting also dictated how and when they killed people. When it came to writing, they decided up front it was going to be the two of them. What George writes in such an authentic way is a human heart in conflict with itself. In his own words, no one is entirely good or entirely evil, regardless of gender. You could skim through any of his Song of Ice and Fire novels and stick a pin in the page and find a character exhibits a wide range of traits. Courageous, cowardly, cunning, naive, it could be a man or a woman. He has no bias. They're all the same, good or bad, all of them at conflict with their own inner morality. The essential concept is nobody is a villain in their own story. Allegedly, A Song of Ice and Fire is an allegory for people putting aside their petty squabbles to fight the threat of climate change. Ugh. You have to remember that George conceived of this story back in the mid-90s, and this would have been viewed as very progressive. Speaking of prophecies, it's time to talk about Bran. His chapters were some of my favorites throughout the novels. Bran's story is compelling and full of intrigue. There's only one problem. It doesn't come across that way on the show. In all fairness to Isaac Hempstead Wright, his portrayal of Bran was great for the first 4 seasons until he hit a snag. He grew up, and he kept growing and growing and growing until he was practically another Hodor being pulled along on a sled. The conclusion to Bran's story is a moral quandary. What makes a truly good king? George's experiment is to attempt to remove corruption and prejudice by giving the honor to an innocent child and to remove the child's obvious shortcomings, forgive the pun, his lack of experience, knowledge and wisdom by allowing him to skin change into other life forms and to see all that has happened in the past mixed with glimpses of what will happen in the future. Bran is just 7 years old when the events of the first novel begin and 10 years old in the pilot episode of Game of Thrones. Hodor carries him around almost like a baby while they are traveling beyond the wall. The imagery is important. This is very easy to empathize with the child in a way you couldn't with a stoic 6-foot 20-year-old being dragged around on a sled by Daddy's mentally impaired manservant. Bran's story is the most steeped in supernatural fantasy elements. He encounters Brendan Rivers, the three-eyed raven, a man with much the same powers as himself that has lived an unnaturally long life as half man, half tree. The undead and the magic of the children of the forest. He travels back in time and warps the mind of young Willis, later known as Hodor. He gains vital knowledge from the past about Jon's heritage and pieces together an elaborate jigsaw puzzle of fragmented medieval society that's just in time to fight the existential threat from the true north. The show's producer's decision not to recast Bran with an age-appropriate actor is where a wheel on the Game of Thrones bus started to fall off. You see, David Benioff and Dan Wise have been hiding a secret, something they kept from George at the infamous meeting where as a test he had asked them if they knew who Jon Snow's mother was. If he had known the truth then about the men he was entrusting his greatest work to, the truth that they didn't care who Jon Snow's mother was, and had nothing but contempt for all the fantasy elements in his novels. Dan Wise in particular was said to have wanted to remove as many fantasy elements as possible, and I quote, "We didn't just want to appeal to that type of fan. They wanted to expand the fan base to people beyond the fantasy fan, to mothers and NFL players." Can you imagine that focus group tasked with trying to find out what mothers and NFL players like? Maybe that's why there was so much wine drinking and unit drugs. David and Dan were fixated on the clash of the Five Kings. They are on the record as saying they never thought the show would go past Robb Stark's murder, and that was their goal because they believed the Red Wedding would be one of the most memorable episodes in television history. People assumed that with Netflix development deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars and an original Star Wars trilogy of their own making on the horizon for Dave and Dan, they were just distracted from Game of Thrones' finishing line. It's more likely, having reached their goal of Red Wedding, they just checked out mentally from the show, as there were really mostly only fantasy elements left to play out. If they were doing the right thing, they could have handed over the show to more experienced and enthusiastic writers and producers. It wouldn't have been the first time a major show had done so. Instead, they chose to toboggan the rotting corpse of a once great show down the hill of a once glorious audience approval rating. Littlefinger and Varys were always an uncomfortable burden for David and Dan. While they were still adapting the story from the books straight to the show, Varys and Littlefinger were characters that dealt in information and manipulation that isn't witnessed by anyone. It's a very hard task to pull off. They were always running the risk of having mustache-twirling villains explain their diabolical plans. Littlefinger's actions were essential to the plot of the entire series. He was the one that started the whole thing by having Lysa poison Jon Arryn and blame the Lannisters. Then he framed Tyrion for the attempt on Bran's life. He assists Eddard in discovering the truth about Jaime and Cersei's bastards and then pretends to help him take power after Robert's death, only to betray him. Then he aids Sansa in her escape and brings her to the Vale. In the books, that is all we are aware of when it comes to Littlefinger. On the show, he was worst offender for teleporting. One moment he would be in the Vale, next day in the North receiving urgent messages by a dispatch rider, and a couple of days later sitting chatting with Cersei in King's Landing. These places were hundreds of miles away from each other. It would have meant months of travelling back and forth. The messages brought by Raven are almost instantaneous as text messages. There was a scene where Arya had just killed Walder Frey and she turns to his teenage widow and says, "When people ask you about what happened here, tell them the North remembers." How could she have known about that phrase? Hundreds of miles away from Winterfell, and then the next episode be shocked to learn that Jon had killed the Boltons and been proclaimed King of the North. Everyone, including Littlefinger, seemed to know that Brienne had beaten the Hound. Brienne and Podrick Payne both despised Littlefinger, so it's bizarre that he would reference it to Sansa. In fact, the garbage was so common by the end of the series, it was a wonder anyone thought much of Bran's ability. Sure didn't they all know everything that ever happened as well? Varys operates in a similar way to Littlefinger, only their motivations differing. Littlefinger, as Varys put it, would watch the world burn, just so he could be king of the ashes. Rather ironic that I believe book Varys would watch King's Landing burn if it meant Daenerys would be queen, because there are major hints in the book that Varys is actually a Targaryen loyalist. But on the show they painted him as a philanthropic man of the people, willing to die for the greater good of the realm. I'm a fan of the actor Aidan Gillen that played Littlefinger, but his and David and Dan's interpretation of Littlefinger is wrong. Lord Baelish was far more convincing and less obvious as Snake. I think Aidan's delivery of his lines came across as mealy-mouthed and insincere. It wasn't plausible that the majority of people he dealt with trusted him. By the time he got his comeuppance, it was almost as if the writers grew bored of him, of the very idea of him, and just put him in a room where the lanky 20-something cheat engine, also known as Bran, exposed all of the things Littlefinger had done that nobody knew about. Sansa sarcastically regurgitated lessons Lord Baelish taught her just before Arya unceremoniously slits his throat. This was a massive anticlimax and a missed opportunity to give Sansa some character development and a real achievement of her own. Up until that point, her only accomplishments were getting her father beheaded and getting Lady Walder Frey and her newborn baby fed to dogs, emasculating Jon Snow at the Battle of the Bastards, emasculating Jon Snow in front of the Northern Lords when he wanted to spare the daughter and son of traitors, and again when he planned to go to Dragonstone to ask Daenerys for help. She later tops all of that up by betraying Jon's trust and telling Tyrion about Jon's true heritage. Let's not even mention, but Arya killed the Night King. line, which is, in a nutshell, is all I needed to prove beyond anyone's reasonable doubt that Game of Thrones had become a steaming pile of dog shit. It would have been far better if Sansa by herself had uncovered the truth about Littlefinger, outwitting him and then summarily executing him. Having Bran reveal it all is a bit like playing a Battle Royale FPS for half an hour, reaching the final circle only to be tracked through a wall, shot and killed by a snot-nosed brat with an aimbot and a wall hack. It just leaves you with hollow and empty inside feeling, like watching paint dry, which is what I'd recommend as an alternative to watching any season after season 4. In the books, Ramsay doesn't marry Sansa. He married Jane Poole, Sansa's childhood friend, and passed her off as Sansa. There was a huge audience backlash at Sansa's treatment at the hands of Ramsay Bolton. And by the time season 8 came along, the writers were caught between a rock and a hard place. Hadn't got the time or interest to flesh out Sansa's storyline, but were terrified of the growing discontent with feminists and the woke mob in general. So the writers resorted to having her mock Tyrion's intelligence, with a scene where she asked Tyrion if he really believes Cersei would send her army north to help them, and then says, "I used to think you were the cleverest person in the world," with an obnoxious smirk on her face. And then have Arya proclaim her the smartest person she had ever met. Because it's the perfect way to convince an audience that's watched her do nothing but stupid things suddenly consider her the smartest person on the show. But, I hear you say, didn't Sansa save Jon at the Battle of the Bastards? Littlefinger offered the Knights of the Vale an army well over 2k strong, mostly well-armoured men on horseback, but Sansa turned him down. If Jon had those troops in his original battle plan, she could have prevented thousands of wildlings and bannermen dying needlessly. Now we get to Tyrion, without a doubt George R. R. Martin's cleverest character. Where to start with how stupid David and Dan made him. On our recent excruciatingly painful rewatch of season 5 to 8, I was honestly looking for signs of concussion or a newly acquired meth or essence of nightshade addiction. Jorah knocking him out could explain the huge dip in IQ points. The first out-and-out stupid thing Tyrion did was to even consider negotiating with Cersei, let alone taking her at her word. But by far the most excruciatingly un-Tyrion-like decision he made was to hide with all the women and children in a crypt full of dead people whilst fighting a necromancer. Well, you know what the motivation was behind all of these ideas. Yep, to empower and raise the cells of more female characters. There were at least 4 jokes between the final episodes of season 7 and episode 2 of season 8 making fun of Jon's height, where there had been none in the previous 6 seasons. It all sprung out of online memes. The show had become a parody of itself, multi-million-dollar production value. There were show-only creations that were good. Lord Tywin's Lannister's interaction with Arya were never in the books, but were very memorable scenes. Podrick Payne, Tyrion's squire, was a small child in the book, but a grown man on the show. His now legendary exploits with the prostitutes Tyrion had hired as a reward were a much-needed dose of levity that was entirely a show creation, as well as his singing of Jenny of Oldstones while he waited for the Battle of the Long Night to begin. You see, the song is about Duncan Targaryen marrying a commoner named Jenny, renouncing her claim to the Iron Throne as a consequence. They both died in a terrible fire at Summerhall, along with Duncan's father, King Aegon V. Some say there are hints within the books that Rhaegar wrote the song, and Podrick singing it ties directly into the next scene with Jon telling Daenerys about his true parentage, a subtle foreshadowing that Jon would renounce his crown for love and that Daenerys and Jon's love affair was doomed. The battle between Tarly Lannister and Daenerys Targaryen on the Gold Road was one of my favourite scenes of the entire series, as well as Jon battling to save the wildlings at Hardhome, Euron's battle with Yara Greyjoy's fleet, and the fight sequence with the Sand Snakes. Drogon burning down King's Landing was visually spectacular. There were flashes of potential after the show ran out of source material that were never truly built upon. Okay, so now we reach one of, if not the worst additions to the show, Euron Greyjoy and his 1,000 ships, even though the Iron Islands have no trees. Euron Greyjoy in general, really he was a dreadful character of a man, an amalgamation of Euron Crowseye, a one-eyed mystic pirate captain of the Silence, a ship crewed by mutes who had their tongues cut out, although in their final battle with Daenerys you can clearly hear his crew shouting things, and his brother Victarion Greyjoy, a formidable warrior that sailed to Meereen to take Daenerys as his wife, decided to go with Euron by himself as this over-the-top cartoon villain with impenetrable plot armor and a cartoon-like overpowered ballista weapon called the Scorpion that fires bolts faster than the speed of sound with all the capacity of a machine gun. Arr, remember those medieval history lessons about medieval warfare with stories of naval battleships sunk in an instant by ballistas? No? They have to be in there somewhere. Anyway, poor Rhaegal gets nailed by 2 to 3 bolts before he has a chance to even know what's going on. Dany is diving a Euron fleet that all of a sudden couldn't hit the broadside of a barn or a very large dragon, banking across all of his ships. Bran tells everyone that the Night King has Viserion, has broken through the wall, and is now leading his horde towards Winterfell. They're all still casually chatting and strolling around. Jon even thinks he has time to send word to Night's Watch to outrun the Night King to Winterfell. Why did it take the Night King so long to get to Winterfell? And why wasn't he doing strafe runs on undead Viserion before his troops got there, burning down the walls of Winterfell? Hell, he would be in with a good chance of burning all of the living in Winterfell by himself. You have to keep in mind he would have no knowledge of Daenerys being at Winterfell. I do have to wonder why, when they know there's an undead dragon coming, they didn't think to make dragon fighting weapons, such as ballista that fires dragon glass bolts. Hell, I bet there are at least a few Unsullied that can throw a dragon glass spear really far and very hard. It would have come in handy against the giants they also knew about. Nope, they're all there waiting outside the walls of Winterfell for some reason. Why use a massive fortress to protect yourself when you can be a badass and fight them outside in the dark? Why give the Dothraki dragonglass arcs when they can just charge mindlessly into the darkness? Oh, the Red Lady randomly shows up and helps him out with witchcraft that the Dothraki are suddenly okay with despite being terrified of it for the first few seasons. So now they are riding off into oblivion with flaming arcs instead of the regular ones that won't kill anything, instead of waiting for the undead horde to reach the walls of Winterfell and flanking them. You know, the kind of strategic thinking Jon already displayed in preparation for the Battle of the Bastards. He must have had a head injury off screen as well. They've got the trebuchets out in front too, set up behind the walls. Nobody told them they are ranged weapons. I suppose, why waste an opportunity to potentially kill a few charging Dothraki? Oh wait, they're the good guys, I forgot. Why have Tyrion giving signals who successfully commanded forces in victorious battles when they can have the Onion Knight who was on the losing side of every battle he was ever involved in? We have the Unsullied behind the fire trenches when you can have them standing in front of them. Why have Rhaegal or Drogon light fire trenches when you can have to just flap about and looking at everything instead? Why use Drogon and Rhaegal to incinerate as much as the Whites before they reach Winterfell when they can flap about and wait for the undead Viserion to swoop in and claw the hell out of them? Why have the archers rain arrows down on the Whites standing in front of the fire trenches when they can just stand there watching them like dopes? While we were at it, did it occur to anyone that Bran could go back in time and do whatever he did to microwave Hodar's brain on the child of the forest that had the bright idea of creating the Night King in the first place? I know, the butterfly effect. Hundreds of thousands of people killed by the Night King would have lived, and hundreds of thousands of people that were alive would no longer exist, yada yada yada. Maybe just microwave Tyrion's brain moments before he suggested travelling north of the wall to capture a White to convince his sister, who he knew was an irrational, selfish, untrustworthy, ruthless, heartless harpy, to help them, because everyone seemed to forget that the wall was enchanted specifically to stop White Walkers and Whites going south. So Tyrion has the great spark of inspiration to send an expedition up there to capture a White, consisting of part of Jon Snow, Jorah Mormont. It wouldn't have taken a genius to guess that if something went wrong up there, Daenerys would be straight to the rescue with dragons, resulting in the Night King getting his own ice dragon to take down the wall. Why did they have to capture an existing White? Couldn't they have taken a condemned man north to the wall, tie his hands and execute him, and by nightfall he would be a White? Jon had first-hand experience of this. He even recommended Lord Stannis burn the dead before nightfall the first time they met. Another awkward, forgetful moment for a character. It just serves the plot development they wanted. Jon and Jorah sail from Dragonstone to Eastwatch by the sea and walk for miles before Jon thinks of telling Jorah he knew his father and offers to return Longclaw, leaving himself without a sword. Looking for him, Jorah turns down the offer. Genji, who never set foot in the frozen north, breaking marathon records over snow and ice to get back to the wall and send Daenerys a raven on Dragonstone for help, that miraculously flies 500 miles in a day, and Daenerys flies the same distance in less than half a day. Damn, those dragons reach Concord speeds. Now is a good time as any to talk about the possibility that Bran may be pure evil. Jojen Reed was a green seer and had power to see the future, and Bran was far more powerful and had a glimpse of a dragon flying over King's Landing. Now, you could argue that it was a glimpse of dragons from the past, but looking back as a viewer in retrospect, it does seem that Bran knew about Daenerys burying everybody in King's Landing, a theory supported by Bran's reaction to seeing Daenerys in person for the first time. He looked disturbed for a moment, as if he could see what she was going on to do. If Bran can see the past, present, and future and has the power to intervene, then that would make him the worst monster in the story. There are even those that theorize that Bran was the one that caused the king, Aerys II, the Mad King, to go insane, burning Bran's own grandfather and killing his uncle as a result, acting as a catalyst for Robert's rebellion and the whole chain of events that led him to becoming King Lanky the Weirdo. Bran the Broken. What was with that too? Tyrion just randomly deciding to give him an insulting nickname out of nowhere. It would be like if on Queen Elizabeth I's coronation they yelled out, "All hail Elizabeth I, the ugly ginger virgin, first of her name." It's actually a good indicator that writers were starting to desperately shoehorn some of George's ideas for an ending into the final episode, again without cultivating it or giving it any rhyme or reason. A few years before final season, George or Martin accepted that he wouldn't be able to complete the final two novels before the show ended, so he brought David Benioff and Dan Weiss to his home to tell them the outline of the ending of the story of A Song of Ice and Fire. All of the characters originate from George, but it's safe to say that Bran and Tyrion were viewpoint characters for George as a storyteller more than the others. Bran is George as a child, essentially. He would spend hours by himself creating elaborate stories, fantastic ventures, and Tyrion is the personification of George at his wittiest. As George said, Tyrion is the kind of person that says a witty thing in real time that he would only think about later. It would make sense that George has a narrative where Bran becomes king and Tyrion his hand. That would feel as though it was fulfilling and earned more so than what David and Dan delivered, which was far below what was needed. We'll talk out the other side of my mouth for a moment, because I do think David and Dan and Emilia Clarke did a good job for the most part with the Daenerys storyline, with the exception of Dany kind of forgot about the Iron Fleet scenes. Putting aside the fact that the constraints were entirely of their own making, it did consistently, methodically rip up everything Daenerys loved from her throughout the ending of season 7 and 8, to the point where it was plausible that her decisions would be more vicious and unforgiving, but to the point of massacring an entire city, that was always going to feel absurd. So there were even points when they were getting things right but ended up failing nonetheless. Varys, the master of Westeros, playing the long game, pulling all the strings, but stupid enough to conspire against the Queen right out in the open with the excruciatingly honourable Jon Snow. The actor Colin Hill, who played Varys, reflected, "It was kind of frustrating. As a whole, it's been overwhelmingly positive and brilliant, but I suppose the last couple of seasons weren't my favourite. I just felt after season 6 I kind of dropped off the edge." David and Dan had made Varys stupid enough to be somewhere Daenerys could easily arrest him and kill him once he had resolved to try and assassinate her. I guess David and Dan kind of forgot Varys isn't that dumb. Jumping back to the first episode of season 7, when Daenerys questions Varys' loyalty and intentions for the first time, even though at the end of the previous season you can see Varys is sailing with Daenerys to Westeros. Did it just not come up on a long voyage in cramped quarters? Were they just playing card games and exchanging dwarf and eunuch jokes the entire time? It's an example of lazy writing and bad continuity editing that stretches all the way back to season 1 with Robert Baratheon himself. After 17 years of spending every day with Jaime Lannister suddenly asked him, "What did the Mad King say when he drove a sword through his back?" He adds, "I never asked." Because, that makes it okay. He just forgot to ask for 17 years. The guy he only refers to as the Kingslayer, what exactly inspired him to kill the king he swore to protect? In another scene, Robert decides to ask Cersei for the first time in 15 to 16 years if there was ever a time she loved him, and again adds, "I never asked," because that's great writing, guys. That's great stuff. This is where I share one of my personal gripes that isn't a big deal, but Mark Addy isn't a good Robert Baratheon. Wait, hear me out. He acted the part really well, but he isn't a diplomatic way of saying this. He isn't a good-looking guy. The book Robert is overweight, but it's a plot point that he was considered good-looking and big and strong and brave in his youth. Why is that important, I'm hearing you ask? Well, here's why. One of the main reasons most of Westeros believe Rhaegar Targaryen kidnapped Lyanna Stark is the fact she was betrothed to a good-looking, impressive, powerful High Lord. Now, Rhaegar wasn't described as ugly or anything, but It was inferred that if he weren't a prince, that Robert would be considered a much superior man in the eyes of any eligible woman in Westeros. I always felt Mark Addy's performance, while good, came across as if they put a random middle management office worker in a beard and asked him to use his speaking voice a couple of octaves deeper to try and pass him off as someone far bigger, imposing, and charismatic. Jaime's story arc conclusion was possibly the worst betrayal of the audience's trust. He leaves his sobbing Brienne after stating that he isn't really a good person, recalling that he strangled his cousin to death, among other things, even though he had in fact smashed his cousin's face in. You would think he remembers something like that. A detail like that is nothing next to whoever was passing as continuity director, not even bothering rewatching the series. What am I saying? They couldn't even bear to sit through the final season and weed out the Starbucks coffee cup, water bottle, and Grey Worm's penis before the show aired. Jaime rides off to be with Cersei, and another sign that David and Dan were looking over George R. R. Martin's shoulder and copying his answers. Or maybe they were just trying to subvert expectations again, those little rascals. Jaime gets caught by Daenerys and not burned alive or beheaded instantly for some reason. Get comfortable, because that happens more later. Anyway, he tells Tyrion that he never cared about the innocent, which subverts the shit out of his redemption arc and leaves you with the feeling that you don't really care about a character like him anyway. He is freed by Tyrion and goes off to be stabbed by Euron the cartoon Greyjoy, something that Euron is apparently happy to die for some unknown reason. He's just in time to get a hold of Cersei and leg it to the bottom of the Red Keep, something he manages to do surprisingly fast for someone that was brutally stabbed only a moment previous. It's glorious. The Red Keep falls on top of them and they have each other, and the show delivers what absolutely nobody wanted or cared about. Cersei and Jaime Lannister lying dead beneath a bunch of bricks. What could they have done differently? Well, the answer lies in fan fiction, funnily enough, and a little tweaking of my own. What if instead of all of that, we see Daenerys seeking Arya out as they make camp a few miles from King's Landing and hiring her to kill a few of her enemies for her? And first on our list is Jaime Lannister, whom she has captive. Arya points out all the virtuous things Jaime has done up to that point that would flesh out the whole Daenerys is beginning to do evil things story arc as well. Tyrion doesn't free Jaime. He assures him that when he talks to the Queen, he is certain that he can convince her to free him. Next time we see how Jaime is entering through the secret entrance that he would most definitely know about after 20 years of being in the King's Guard, and wouldn't need Tyrion to tell him about. Sorry, that was another petty gripe. I'll stop, I swear. There is no confrontation with Euron at all, and he just burned with his fleet. We see Jaime rescuing Cersei by bringing her to the bottom of the Red Keep, stopping for a moment to place his hands on Cersei's face and kiss her, and we realize as an audience at the same time as Cersei that Jaime now has two hands. He strangles her and stands up and removes his face. It was Arya. It would be such a bittersweet ending. The audience would be so happy to see Cersei die at Arya's hands, but unable to enjoy it because it was bought with Jaime's life. By the way, I'd just like to point out that Nikolai Coster-Waldau was fantastic as Jaime Lannister. I think his performance in the show was easily the most underrated. Lena Headey's portrayal as Cersei was a little off. I know, controversial, I think. Just think her interpretation of Cersei wasn't right. I never felt like she conveyed the sympathetic side of Cersei and descended into the mustache-twirling villain category with Palau aspects Euron Greyjoy and Aidan Gillen's Littlefinger. Off-screen, Lena Headey had a romantic relationship with Jerome Flynn, that played Bronn. It didn't end well, to say at least, and reportedly Lena Headey had it written in her contract that she was never to have a scene with him on the show. Not a great development for two characters that are playing characters in the same story arc. We're left with a lot of exposition such as Cersei said this and that, and Cersei sent me to kill you, and promised me Riverrun crap. Bronn was one of those Q-score characters I was talking about. Not at all important in George's books, but the fans of the show seemed to really like him, so David and Dan started adding more and more scenes with him in them. Who would forget Bronn catching up the Lannister brothers in Winterfell and demanding he finally get his castle, which was a meme online for years at that point, another plot development generated by Q-scores and online memes. At that point, another plot development generated by Q-scores and online memes was Tormund Giantsbane's fixation on Brienne, or the Big Woman as he would say. Anyway, the Lannister bros promised Bronn Highgarden, only to have the Onion Knight promise his entire territory to the Unsullied in the Game of Thrones parody ending titled The Iron Throne. Oh wait, crap, that was the real ending. Lucky the Unsullied showed no interest in the fertile soil of the Reach, or the new High Lord Bronn would fertilize it further with eunuch corpses. Okay, let's talk about it. I will set the scene. Grey Worm slitting the throats of unarmed Lannister soldiers, Daenerys Maleficent giving the great dictator speech while her army that really would look at home fighting on the side of Mordor, cheering enthusiastically. Daenerys accuses Tyrion of treason for freeing Jaime. He throws his hand of the Queen badge down the steps in front of her. She has him arrested for some reason instead of having executed. Wacky girl. Jon visits Tyrion in his cell. Tyrion confronts Jon about Daenerys killing hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children in King's Landing. Jon initially says he won't defend her actions, then immediately contradicts himself and launches the defense of Daenerys. Those wacky writers and their consistency, eh? This is another clear-cut sign that one writer was writing a piece and handing it over to another writer to free up their time, possibly to sign Netflix contracts and swirl gourmet coffee around their mouth, or maybe they had a Pokemon Go account that really ate up their time. For whatever reason, they passed it over to the cohort who wasn't paying attention to what had already been written in the other scene. Maybe they were just so indecisive with what they wanted to play out on screen that they got caught between two possible outcomes. We know they had an entire alternative storyline worked out for Jorah Mormont where he didn't die and instead took the Blackwood Jon at the wall. I quite like this alternative ending. In the books, when Jorah's father, Lord Commander Jorah Mormont, is dying, he asks that word be sent to Jorah and to tell him to take the Black. For Jorah, it would be history repeating itself. He had fallen in love with a woman that would never love him, and yet again, in a way, ruined his world trying to give her what she wanted. A traditional romantic tale of unrequited love. Nah. The new fanbase Dan and Dave so carefully cultivated were turning out endless amounts of Sir Friendzone memes. Poor Jorah become nothing but a punchline. Dan and Dave favoured putting him out of his misery rather than surviving. The optics of a simp outliving his queen would have enraged the progressive overlords. That is another hint that they had George's blueprint and were ignoring it in favour of their own poor creative choices. It would have been so much better to see it finally done on Jorah. Daenerys is a fatal disease he was spreading on his own people. Yeah, I borrowed that from Lady Olenna's remarks on Cersei. So what? I'm going to skip over much of what happened at the meeting of the High Lords in the series finale, apart from Sam spontaneously suggesting a switch to democratic rule, only to be roundly ridiculed and dismissed fast as on Edmure by Sansa. Oh, I wish the episode would end faster so we could see her being crowned Queen of the North, said nobody that watched the show for more than 5 minutes. Why don't they have Sam inventing the contraceptive pill or TikTok while they're at it? Why would Aemon agree to break off the North from the other 6 kingdoms when Brandon Stark is the king of Westeros? To give it to a whingy brat that's only accomplishments was inadvertently getting her entire family and extended family slaughtered and putting some letters and breastplates? Why wouldn't Yara Greyjoy want to be the queen of the Iron Islands all of a sudden? Why the hell would Dorne accept that shite either? They were never conquered, they only joined the other 6 kingdoms through marriage. Why wouldn't they strike it out on their own again? Why does nobody mention that Jon is Aegon Targaryen, the last living heir of House Targaryen? Worth a mention at least, even if they are all convinced Targaryen should never rule Westeros again. Last we get to Jon Red Herring, I don't want to, Snow's ending. He's just stabbed Daenerys in the heart. Drogon burns the Iron Throne and flies off with Daenerys in his talons. We don't see what happens to Jon next. It's all off-screen. The reason it's off-screen is simple. Of all the scenarios of what would happen to Jon after Drogon flies away, the one that leads to Jon being locked in a cell for killing Daenerys makes the least sense. Nobody witnessed Daenerys' death apart from Jon and Drogon. Scenario 1. Jon kicks some ash over the bloodstain on the throne room floor, leaves the throne room, gathers his troops and returns to North where he's safe and leaves the Dothraki and Unsullied to speculate where Daenerys went. Scenario 2. Jon kicks some ash over the bloodstain just as the Unsullied or Dothraki enter the throne room. Where is the Queen? Oh, Daenerys. She's at Westeros is kind of crap, and she much prefers Meereen, after all. You're all to get in your ships. I should meet you there. Oh, by the way, do the Dothraki still have that rule where they follow the one that kills the Khaleesi and that? I mean the Khal. Why do you say this? Did you kill the Queen? Me, no. I was just making conversation, really. See ya, lads. Clear with the blood. I mean ash, won't ya? Dave and Dan went with scenario 3. Jon drops to his knees in front of Grey Worm and confesses, I did it. I killed Dany. Oh, I am so mad at you, Jon Snow. But you are lucky I pulled a muscle in my throat-slitting arm. So in that scenario, Jon not only sacrifices his own life and having witnessed the Unsullied slitting unarmed Lannister soldiers' throats, the thought they would do the same thing to the Northern soldiers never crosses his mind. That flies in the face of everything Jon Snow is. He always puts the greater good first. That greater good in that scenario would be the safety of his own soldiers and Westeros as a whole, because for all he knew, he was still the only thing between Westeros and the remaining forces loyal to Daenerys. I have to give an honorable mention to the story threads I did like and stayed true to the source material for the most part. Basically everything involving Alfie Allen's Theon Greyjoy was a privilege to watch, apart from the corny moment when one of the Ironborn repeatedly kicks him where his genitalia is no longer located. How could I mention poor Theon without mentioning the diabolical bastard Ramsay Snow, played by talented Ewan Rion? Everything they did with the part was fantastic, really. Stannis the Menace, masterfully played by Stephen Delane, with his blind devotion to the Lord of Light and his belief that he was the prince that was promised, leading him to his destruction, stayed true to the spirit of what George was writing. Ironically, aptly concluding Stannis' story with him burning his lovely, kind, endearing daughter alive to assure a victory that would never come, just left a terrible stomach-churning sensation with the audience, and a miserable aftertaste. What does it really say about the show when the only story arc that stayed true to the spirit of George's source material, after they'd run out of source material, left us feeling unsatisfied and just miserable? Add to that the overkill of Brienne finding a defeated Stannis and beheading him, further displayed Game of Thrones' erratic and plausible outcome.
To see this very unique, very unconventional woman enduring abuse from a man, and then the power lay in the fact that that got turned on its head and the two develop a begrudging respect for each other that's intense and close and doesn't have its roots in sexuality. And I was thrilled to see that at last, and I felt it was very powerful, modern representation of women, and long overdue.
Ultimately, Game of Thrones died by 1,000 cuts comprising of terrible creative changes, the influence of contemporary intersectional feminist ideology that removed the formula of a politically incorrect show with nudity, witty dialogue, morally grey characters of both sexes, compelling well-layered, tragic or dramatic events that propelled it to its iconic position in the first place, and a lack of interest and leadership shown by David and Dan Wise by the end had truly earned their moniker, Dumb and Dumber. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider sharing and subscribing. That's it. Take it easy. See you in the next one, bud.